First, everyone, I just want to say thank you for hanging in there. I know this is quite a long webinar, so Al and I are very excited to present this work to you, so thank you for hanging in there. Before we jump in, I do want to say thank you to the NEA research staff. They were very encouraging and have supported Alan and myself in really trying to push the analysis that's possible with the SPPA and to really look at it critically, both the survey itself and to consider the results of its analysis critically in the context of a broader cultural ecology and really what our conceptualization of arts participation really is. Today, we will spend some time going over the context of this research and reviewing the conceptual frameworks that guide our analysis, review the research aims and the analyses that are included in the complete monograph. I'll present to you some of the highlights of the results of the analysis, and then spend some time discussing the implications that we see stemming from this work, both for arts practitioners and for policymakers. First, in the consideration of the context of this research. As Sunil has mentioned previously, the SPPA was first fielded in 1982, and it really had a goal of providing a consistent baseline of information on arts audiences. And as previously presented, this has largely placed an emphasis on attendance rates at benchmark arts events, which include attendance at ballet, opera, theater, both musical and non-musical, jazz, classic music, and attendance at art museums. And it's looking at this aggregate rate of arts attendance that gives us the commonly cited statistic of 34.6% of U.S. adults attending arts. But we know that the environment in which arts organizations function and in which they exist has drastically changed since 1982. And these cultural shifts I don't think are startling to anyone, as they very much affect our daily lives, not only the landscape and the environment within which arts organizations are functioning. First is the proliferation of technology. Both the actual devices are available to us, but also the range of content that's available and the immediacy with which that content becomes available to us. Secondly, diversification, really the expansion of aesthetic tastes, the evolution of cultural and artistic forms, how people updating and modernizing cultural traditions, blending of different artistic forms, so those definitions and the boundaries of art forms are blurring, as well as the do-it-yourself, the DIY culture, and the diversification of setting within which we believe arts activities to happen. No longer are they bound to purposefully built arts venues, but they happen in coffee shops and pretty much anywhere that you could possibly think of, community centers, places of worship, etc. And thirdly, accessibility and flexibility. Really, we are very much used to high-speed exchange, our demand for high-speed exchange, and delayed decision-making, and this all very much impacts how arts organizations are having to function. So while much has been written about this changing cultural climate for arts participation, the measurement systems that we have been using to describe it have been very slow to adapt. And as I mentioned, the primary measure that has been used is attendance at benchmark arts events, that 34.6%. And we challenge, the extent to which this statistic is relevant for how we are conceptualizing and understanding arts participation. So really at the crux of this monograph is to think about what is the framework, what framework is relevant to consider arts participation. With this new conceptual framework, what can be learned and how can we best exploit the SPPA data to get useful information? And then what are the implications for practice and for policy? So we do put forth that there are more relevant conceptual frameworks out there to help us figure out how to measure this notion of arts participation. First, we put forth that it's the skill level of the artist or the participant in the arts experience. Sort of gone are the days where there are professional or amateur artists. This dichotomy doesn't quite hold anymore. There's the pro-am revolution that's written about by Charles Ledbetter, the professional amateur, where we talk about how even if someone's not necessarily earning a paycheck or is associated with a professional organization, they're very much highly organized, highly skilled, and very active in the arts. And so we put forth, the notions of employment or pecuniary compensation to determine who's an artist and not doesn't quite hold anymore. But perhaps a way to think about it is the skill level of an artist and the salience of their work to their life. Secondly, the form of artistic expression. And this has been mentioned previously in my presentation and in Mark's, talking about the blurring of artistic forms, the evolution of artistic works, and really how do we define what art form someone is working within. Thirdly, the setting in which an activity occurs, and not only the physical space within which it takes place, but also the social context within which it takes place. And then fourthly, the degree to which the individual exercises creative control over the activity within which they are engaging. And this we use very much to guide our analysis for this monograph, and I'll ask Alan to speak to this in a little more detail. Alan?
Thank you, Jennifer, and good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to share with you just two frameworks that we found helpful in thinking about our SPPA data analysis. And the first is this 5 modes of participation framework, which actually came out of a study that I did in Connecticut back in 2004 with the Connecticut Commission on Culture and Tourism. Essentially, it posits 5 modes based on the individual's level of creative control over the activity. So if an individual has complete control over an activity, it is inventive. It is a unique and idiosyncratic expression of that individual's creativity. And then as the amount of creative control decreases, we have other categories. Interpretive activities would include performing a work of art that someone else created, or painting something that someone else had created, singing in a choir, and so forth. Curatorial participation is a very emerging area of organizing, editing, selecting art to your aesthetic aesthetic sensibility, but you did not create the art. So, for example, downloading music or even choosing wallpaper for your computer screen. Observational participation is self-understandable. It is the act of taking in or observing a performance or exhibition essentially created by someone else. And then ambient participation is art that happens to you that you do not choose. So these categories do not line up perfectly with the SPPA data items, although they do certainly. One of the SPPA items, for example, was owning original art, which would be a curatorial form of participation. Certainly the attendance questions line up with observational. But we found this helpful in just thinking about the different modalities of participation at the individual level. And while this is helpful at the individual level, it also raises another question, which is how do we understand participation at the local, regional, or national level? And here we draw on a very simple but intuitive, simple and intuitive framework that came out of a study by John Kreidler and Philip Traunstein from Cultural Initiative Silicon Valley back in 2005. We've adapted their diagram a little bit to be spherical instead of hierarchical. But at the sort of innermost sphere, we have professional, cultural goods and services, which is where most nonprofit arts groups operate in terms of offering professional programming to the public. The middle sphere would be participatory cultural practice, for example, any activity regardless of skill level, typically decentralized and that happen in the community. And then the larger sphere, which is sort of the foundation of the whole ecology, is cultural literacy, which is an awareness and appreciation of arts and culture in daily life, and really embedded in daily activities, including consuming culture via the media, telling stories, preparing traditional foods, all of that stuff. So we have found this to be extraordinarily helpful in contextualizing the various SPPA items in a framework that might be used for policy purposes. Jennifer?
Thank you. And we really think about this framework really guides some of our interpretation and discussion about implications, about particularly as the funding becomes tighter for the arts and culture, where in this ecology framework might investments be made, and what impact does that have on the public? So this is a good framework for guiding kind of discussion of implications. Next, I want to move on to the research aims and describe the analyses that are included in the complete monograph. The SPPA data includes kind of three modes of participation: through attendance, which has been discussed, through arts creation, where someone actually is involved themselves personally in the creation of an artwork, and then engagement through electronic media. So we investigate each of those modes. We use a broad set of demographics, slightly broader than has previously been used in some of the SPPA reports. We do look at the impact of prior arts lessons and of arts education on participation, and at the crux of our analysis is really looking at the relationship between the three modes of participation captured in the SPPA, very much emphasizing a closer look at the relationship between attendance and personal arts creation, because there's been much debate and discussion about that here in the US and internationally, and its impacts on practice and policy. And when the data allows, we look at the patterns of participation over time. So a few highlights from looking at the relationship between attendance and arts creation. In the reference period within which the data was captured from May 2007 to May 2008, 33% of U.S. adults reported that they engaged in both creative activity and in attendance. And this is quite large from when we had hypothesized what it might be. And then we can look at to see that only 17% of U.S. adults attend only, 12% create only, but 38% of the U.S. population reported that they did not attend, nor did they create any artwork. This chart shows the percentage of U.S. adults who participated in the art form, in the different art forms via attendance or through creative participatory practice. And then the columns illustrate the distribution of the modes within each of the art forms. So if you can see along the bottom axis there, the percentages describe the percentage of U.S. adults who engaged in the art form through attendance or through arts creation. So the greatest percent at the rightmost column, approximately 48%, engaged through either of these two modes in visual arts. The leftmost column with music, approximately 38% engaged either through attendance or creation in music, and then approximately 22% in theater and approximately 8% through dance. Now, looking at the distribution of these two modes of participation, looking at the colors in the columns, we can see that the greatest overlap, the black colored segments there, of adults who attend and who create are within music and within visual arts, whereas the distributions for theater and for dance are more dichotomous and have larger portions of adults who participate via attendance as opposed to personal creation. Very briefly, some highlights when we look at all three modes of engagement. This includes the attendance, arts creation, and through electronic media. We can come up with a summary diagram that really represents the rates at which U.S. adults are reporting participation through these different modes. In aggregate, 74% of U.S. adults reported arts participation when we look at all three modes. Looking at each of these modes individually, separately attendance, creation, and electronic media, they are roughly equivalent at approximately 50% of the U.S. adult population reporting that they engaged in through that mode. And then lastly, many of the prior SPPA analyses have put an emphasis on attendance. And if we are to move away from that, this statistic really shows what additional activity can be captured in the statistics, with approximately 1 in 4 adults reported arts participation exclusive of attendance. This graph is similar to the one I previously showed, where the percentage of participation is reported at the bottom of each column, and then the distribution of the modes within each art form is in the color blocks of the columns. So greatest here, and this is participation being reported in the art form through any of the three modes. The leftmost column with music has approximately 53% of the U.S. adult population reporting any engagement in music. Secondly, visual arts, approximately 52% of adults. Theater, approximately 30%, and dance, 16% of the adult population reporting having engaged with dance through any of the three modes. And while the distribution is here, there are a number of observations that can be made. I just want to focus on one or two here for the purpose of this presentation. And what we can see by looking at theater and visual arts is that we can see the majority of participation happens through attendance, whereas the majority of participation in music and in dance happen primarily through electronic media. And if we drill down a little further, focusing at dance, we can see that of that 16% who participate in dance at all, 39.5% access dance via broadcasts, but do not attend whatsoever. And this is the greatest portion across any of the art forms where broadcasts, engagement through broadcast exclusive of attendance is the highest, suggesting that there is a large audience for the art form of dance, but this audience is not necessarily an attending audience. So these are the types of conclusions and analysis that can be drawn from this analysis in the monograph. Very briefly, some additional highlights is we looked at demographics and the role that they play in explaining the attendance rates that we see across the different modes. And looking at attendance rates at benchmark arts events, we find that demographics only explain approximately 20% of the variation. And looking at what role demographics play in explaining arts creation, they explain less than 6% of the variation, leaving to ask, what explains that remaining percentage. And so the monograph includes some exploratory analysis that allows us to look at some of the underlying issues in the data where it may not be directly captured by a data point or a question from the data set, but allows us to do some looking at broader themes that are available in the data to explain that remaining percentage, including really aspects of the arts experience that may explain some of this, whether it's a solitary experience, something that's perhaps more public, and really trying to at least develop some hypotheses from the data that can be further explored about what people prefer in terms of their arts experience. And as has been previously discussed by Nick, the impact of arts lessons on adults' likelihood to participate. We look at the difference of likelihood, and approximately 30%, any adult who has engaged in prior arts lessons is approximately 30% more likely than an adult who has not had a prior arts lesson to each attend an arts event, 30% more likely to participate in any arts creation activities, and 30% more likely to listen or to watch broadcasts or recordings. In terms of implications, we see that having the notion of a broader framework for arts participation, as well as what we were able to figure out from the analyses, that there are some significant implications for both arts practitioners and for policy. In terms of practice, this helps us think about and perhaps pose some strategies for engaging people in the creation of artistic work, saying that there's such a large overlap between how individuals attend and both engage in different art forms through participatory practice. Thinking about strategies for engaging audiences and visitors inside and outside of purposefully built arts venues. Think about where do the activities occur, where do individuals engage creatively in any art form, and as well as rethinking the usage of art infrastructure. Are there ways that we can use existing venues that can maximize both individuals' desires to attend as well as to create? And really the implications for policy is this shift away from focusing on indicators of health of an audience base for nonprofit arts organizations towards a focus on the scope of artistic and cultural expression of individuals. And this really encourages an inquiry and further investigation into arts that are relevant to different communities, and that the communities can be defined by socio-demographics as well as geographic communities. And as I mentioned previously, looking at the model of the cultural ecology poses opportunities and questions about the development of new investment strategies to support how individuals in the U.S. are engaging with the arts and the public value that can stem from that. Sunil?
Thank you very much, Jennifer and Alan. As you can see, I mean, all of these three studies, culminating here in the one you just saw from Jennifer and Alan, really do try to go beyond the standard ways of reporting out arts participation through our data, and really try to understand whether what are the implications of these various demographics in relation to arts participation, as well as what the relationships are between arts participation and behaviors such as education, different and cultural tastes. So I'm now going to turn it over to again for some more questions for Jennifer, or actually start questions for Jennifer and Alan. One is basically asking, well, actually, it's a comment that's somewhat supportive, I suppose. It says, what fabulous support there is for the need to include theater and dance in our schools from this data. I think what that might be referring to is some of the findings about creativity and creation related to arts participation. There's also a couple of general questions which I'll just answer off the bat and return to. One is, where can one find these monographs, reports, and perhaps even the slides? So I'll explain about the webinar. Will be archived at the end of this presentation, but for now you can go to arts.gov/research and you'll see the reports as well as a research note which attempts to synthesize these findings. So we're going to move pretty soon into the general questions for all of you because of time constraints. I did want to get you maybe ask one question to Jennifer before we do that, and that is the question is, the historic definition of participation has been based around paid attendance to support the creation of the work. What does the shift to non-paid attendance modes such as creation or media participation mean for financial sustainability? Well, that's a big question. Do you think you can tackle it?
Ooh, Alan, you're welcome to jump in here as well.
So the question again is, what does the shift to non-paid attendance modes mean for financial sustainability? And I assume that means for arts organizations particularly, given that there is this appetite for creating and performing and participating through media.
Well, sure.
I'll take a quick stab, a quick stab at that, and just say that, ironically, Sunil, some of the most financially sustainable programs are those offered by community music, theater, and dance schools that derive tuition from registration fees. We find in some of our planning work that those are some of the programs that actually are financially sustainable and involve creation. So I don't think people should run out and say from our monograph that all orchestras and theater companies and dance companies need to do free programs. That's not at all what we're saying. Although free programming certainly does play a role in the creative vitality of a community. But I think there are a lot of examples emerging all over the place of nonprofit arts groups who are introducing programs that actively involve audiences and others in the community and growing their support base because of it.
Thank you, Alan. It's very helpful. Any other questions for Alan and Jennifer? I see there is a question here, and it's really asked of all the researchers, but maybe you two can answer. Did you distinguish between ballet and dance other than ballet in your study?
Jennifer?
Do you remember that, Jennifer?
Sure. Looking at it separately, depending upon the year, we did look at it separate, but to look at arts creation in terms of how questions were asked in different waves of the data of the SPPA, we did aggregate dance and other dance together in terms of arts creation, but we do look at it separately and in aggregate for attendance. And then the electronic media question only asks about dance generally, as opposed to looking at the disciplines separately.
Yes, thank you. One of the things, and I'll quickly go into the concluding slide, and we'll take questions, general questions. But one of the things that's important to note, again, is this is a survey that's been going on since 1982, and we've conducted it about 5 or 6 times. And each iteration slightly differs from the other, but the reported aggregate data is always meant to be on those questions that were consistent over time. And so some of the new forms of media, of course, have changed and have been reflected accordingly in the questionnaire, but we've had to really keep up with that in a sustainable way. And so thanks to all the work of these researchers and others, we've managed to come up with a way to do that in 2012 with a new questionnaire, which at some later date we will be sharing with you.